Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to this weekend flip, right? In the very first weekend flip, where you get to see my little buddy. Say hello to Pierre. He's 1 year old now, and I love him very, very much. I love you too, buddy. So anyway, this is my little baby boy, Pierre. He's very, very sweet. If he barks during this flip, I apologize, right? So now the big thing about it, though, in general, is that we're going to continue where we left off in class. But before we get there, we got a really big thing I got to shout out real fast. We got to tell F period that they did such a good job on Friday, right? Friday, like F period, very, very impressive. I was blown away by a lot of these kids and stuff like that. Dempster, Amelia, Isabella, whichever Dunn twin is in my class. I don't know which one is the one in F period, but y'all did a great job. Diani did a great job. Destiny answering a bunch of questions and stuff like that. We learned the prayer in German. It was a lot of fun. And so also, other guys, y'all were doing great as well. But this is the very first flip that I've recorded all year where F period has already had class, and I can actually, say thank you and having a great class and stuff like that. So the big thing about it, though, is we're going to jump head first into what we were talking about recently, right? And we're going to get right back onto it, and I'm going to try to not say so and like a bunch of times, Brianna. Now, the big thing, though, is that we have to leave off, we left off in class talking about the Mycenaeans, right? We talked about the Minoans a lot. We did a really, really in-depth study of them. We talked about Sir Arthur Evans and his discovery of Kenosis, and we talked about the myth of King Minos and the Minotaur and all this stuff, and Theseus and how he's just like rah rah rah. I have my own little Minotaur right here because he's got really big ears. So now the big thing about it in general, though, is we talked all about that stuff, and we also talked about how Linear A, their writing system, we can't actually decipher it. We also talked as well about how their frescoes tell us a lot more about their society than any other thing that we have found of theirs, right? And we discussed how they were a seafaring and trade people, but then out of nowhere around 1400 BC, they're going to start kind of hitting the bricks, right? They're going to start kind of disappearing, and then there's going to be a rise of a new group of people, right? And the new group of people who are going to rise up in Greece are known as the Mycenaeans, right? And the Mycenaeans are culturally very, very, very different from the Minoan people, right? Now, the big thing about it in general is I do not want y'all to get confused about this, though, okay? Because the Minoans were there, the Mycenaeans popped up at one point. You're going to feel a little wishy-washy about some of the dates because they're not Minoans start, Mycenaeans start, blah, 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 blah. It's history's not that easy anymore for y'all, right? Because history is kind of a tapestry of a lot of different dates and events and themes that are kind of all occurring at the exact same time, right? And so, that means, look, Godoy, I know I found out that we had beef, apparently, for 2 years that I didn't even know existed, but please don't fight me about how confusing this might get, all right? So now, look, the biggest thing about it, though, in general, is that you have to understand that they are culturally different from the Minoans, so it does help you when comparing the two of them back and forth, right? We believe that the Mycenaeans are going to migrate from southern Russia and settle in the mainland area of Greece around 1750 BC, give or take, okay? And the mainland area of Greece is known as Peloponnese, right? Definitely do me a favor and definitely highlight that word, all right? See, that's a word that screams fill in the blank for Mr. Terry, right? Because it's a very unique and very interesting word, and it's a word that I can focus on really well, and I can show you on a map, and so on a fill in the blank, maybe I'll just put the map on there, and I'll ask you, what is that mainland section called? And Peloponnese is located right here, right? So the little triangle is where the Mycenaean City stronghold was located, but this blue chunk of Greece is Peloponnese. And notice, it's very, very close to Crete, which is where the Minoans were actually located as well. But that's where the Mycenaeans are going to settle. And they're culturally really, really different from the Mycenaeans in a replete and huge number of different ways. But the best way to talk about Mycenaean history is to break it into two different phases, right? We analyze the Mycenaeans in two different chunks of their history. This being because it shows us a dramatic leap forward in intelligence by them, right? The big thing about it in general is that the Mycenaeans started off with a little bit more of a primitive setup when the Minoans were actually really, really blossoming and being super intelligent, whereas then later on, they're going to become the very intelligent ones, and this is going to coincide very, very closely right around the time that the Mycenaeans take over what was formerly known as the Minoans, right? And so the big thing to start off with is that sorry about that. The wife called. Now, anyway, the big thing about it, though, that you have to understand is that the Mycenaean history era started out in this thing known as the shaft grave era, right? So notice really quickly, I got a lot of pictures on here, but I don't have a lot of words, which means that you're going to kind of have to describe this in your own little way a little bit. But the shaft grave era is how the Minoans buried their dead, right? So we actually analyze the Mycenaeans really in a big way by their tombs, right? By where they buried famous dead people. Now, why would we do this, Mr. Terry? Mainly due to the fact that tombs are very well known for preserving a buttload of artifacts, right? So the thing about it is that during the shaft grave era, that's when the Mycenaeans really started building their city stronghold and burying some of their famous dead figures, right? Now the thing about it is the shaft grave era for the Mycenaeans was very, very simple, right? Because a shaft grave, all it was basically just a round little graveyard, very, very simple, tombstones marking where each place was or where each grave was, and this is what this grave looked like in and of itself. Literally, they would just dig a really deep hole or a shaft all the way down about 40 feet, which is really, really deep, and then actually build a stone box down there and tomb and put the body and a lot of items down there inside of it. Like, so they would put tons of things that were sacred to the person that died down there in that tomb with them. But think about this for a hot second. This is why we love to talk about the Mycenaeans, and this is why we knew about the Mycenaeans for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before we ever knew who the Minoans were, because of their burial practices, right? Because their burial sites were so deeply buried that it kept all this stuff perfectly preserved. Right? Like, so now we found all kinds of stuff inside of Mycenaean shaft graves, right? And inside those shaft graves, we've noticed a lot of things that are kind of very emblematic of their culture, right? So the big ones that are on this pictures right here, these two things are helmets, right? Helmets that were used by Mycenaean soldiers, and they actually are lined with boar tusks that have been split, right? So it demonstrates to us that maybe Mycenaean warriors were also very avid hunters as well, because wild boar is a very wild game that exists near the Mediterranean, especially in Italy and Greece, right? But these boar tusk helmets show us a lot. We also have found bronze swords and things like that, which shows us that they were maybe militarily advanced or knew how to at least wield bronze and things like that. And we were looking at their city area. They had like a very intricate burial system. This is known as the citadel and the grave circle, where we found a lot of this stuff. But the most famous item that's been ever found inside of one of the shaft graves is actually this gold death mask right here. That thing right there is known as the Mask of Agamemnon, right? Now, Agamemnon is spelled Agemenon, Agamemnon, right? So now, I probably misspelled that, but it's going to be fine. We'll fix it when we're in class, right? Now, Agamemnon is considered one of the most famous Greek history or like Greek figures that has ever been seen. He's also a part of a very famous myth that we'll talk about in this flip as well. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is that this probably isn't his mask, all right? So the German archaeologist that actually discovered this thing just said, oh, it must be the Mask of Agamemnon, and we just named it that, you know what I mean? Like, so, but more than likely, it just like actually belonged to a very, very wealthy Mycenaean in general. But the big thing about it also shows us that they knew how to work with gold, that they actually may have had some access to some money and some wealth and some other, but the thing about it is when we're looking at these gold like items that we've recovered from these shaft graves and stuff, they're nowhere near on par with the actual artistic development of the Minoans, right? So it demonstrates to us early on in their era, and early when the Mycenaeans were settling their civilization and creating their stronghold and creating their city, that they just weren't as intelligent, probably, like, as a community. I don't mean like as people, but like as a community as the Minoans were, right? Now, when we move forward, though, in time, all of a sudden, right around this thing known as the Quine Era, which actually in English means common era, or their beehive burial period, right? So it's actually one or the other, right? I'll ask you one or the other on the test. You'll be able to use either or, but actually this era shows a dramatic leap forward in Mycenaean intelligence, and it also coincides with the fall of the Minoans. So that means that now this warrior-like culture, who maybe wasn't as giant-brained as the Minoans, are now starting to become very intelligent, right? And if they're becoming very intelligent and they're taking over the Minoans, maybe they're adopting a lot of their ideas. And we can actually see this in a lot of different things, because the Mycenaean City began to have frescoes on it, which is the artwork that the Minoans did first, right? So that means that maybe they were trading with the Minoans in a really big way, right? We start to see as well new suits of armor made completely out of bronze coming out of some of these Mycenaean graves and stuff like that. And here's the other thing. Speaking of the graves in the tombs took on a distinctly new structure, and we call them the beehive burial chambers, right? Beehive burial chambers are way more complex than those shaft grave chambers, because these are actually built inside of a hill, right? They would actually literally cut into the side of a hill, dig out this massive amount on the inside of it, and line the entire inner chamber with stones. And then that way they could actually put a royal or a king's body on the actual ground, surround it with treasures, hold a funeral, and then they could actually decorate the doorway with sacred stones and things like that. And sheep could be brought in for sacrifice towards the gods as well as this kingly figure. Priests and priestesses would bring offerings of food and wine, and musicians would play things. So this just demonstrates to us that if we're looking at the beehive graves and the shaft graves, it just looks as though, man, they just got much more intelligent, right? But here's the thing though. What's a really, really unique value when somebody becomes smart enough to build these things, but they're also still very warrior-like? That means they're probably going to start going out and taking some stuff over. And so the Mycenaeans begin to push their influence into all these different areas, right? They start taking over many of the islands that surround them. They start really, really advancing all their ideas and spreading their influence and taking over and subjugating a lot of different people, right? They took over what was formerly the Minoan kingdom at the Palace of Knossos, and you can actually see a very distinct difference between the two of them, especially in the way their cities were designed, right? So the Mycenaeans, these artifacts tell us a lot about them, right? And it tells us that they are a culture that values war, right? They value war in a big way, and you can see it also in the way they constructed their city, right? So remember, Knossos was kind of marketplace slash palace slash labyrinth slash art expo slash no wall around it. Mycenaea is the name of the Mycenaean palace, right? So look, the Mycenaeans built the city known as Mycenaea. It's not the most creative name ever, but give them a break. Now, the biggest thing about it in general is that the Mycenaean kingdom, or the Mycenaean city, had one entrance in or out of it, known as the Lion's Gate. And it was heavily fortified by a giant stone wall that went all the way around the outside of it. And raised up on the top of a hillside was this thing known as the Citadel, right? And they had their religious centers down here. The shaft graves, were actually the oldest part of the city, was down here on the lower end as well. And there is the Lion's Gate, surrounded by this fortified wall with a huge amount of mountains behind them. That shows us and demonstrates to us that the Mycenaeans were always ready for a fight. We're always trying to protect themselves, and we're always ready to make sure that they were the ones that could come out on top, because they were expecting to go to war all the time, not expecting to just go out and find it, right? So they were even trying to protect their homeland, which is a very important element because it just shows us the major differences between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans and their culture and things like that, right? And so looking at this entrance, that again is the Lion's Gate. That was the only way to get in and out of the entire Mycenaean kingdom. And I believe, this has never been verified or anything like that, but I believe actually the interesting thing is that there's a film production company now called Lionsgate Films, and I really, really wonder, and I can't find it anywhere online, if they're actually named after each other, right? Now, the big thing about it though is, what about the Minoans, right? Well, the thing about it is as they're advancing and as this thing progresses, they bring the Minoans under their control, right? Now, here's another interesting little thing, is the Mycenaeans also had their very own style of writing, and it looked insanely different from the Minoan writing, so we have to give it a separate name. Where the Minoans write in linear A, the Mycenaeans write in linear B, right? And their writing looks intrinsically different, and their writing also looks much more like Mesopotamian / Egyptian / early Greek writing. And the interesting thing about it is, we can actually translate little bits and pieces of this writing, right? We can actually translate it, and we believe that this is the foundation for modern Greek language and writing, right? Now, we also know about the Mycenaeans that they love to go out and take people over, and there's a lot of stories about them doing this, because much like the Minoans had the myth about Minos and the Minotaur, and Theseus and the Minotaur, and the name of the Aegean Sea and where it comes from, probably the biggest story ever in Greek mythology is about the Mycenaeans, right? And it relates to their conquest, because they expanded over most of modern-day Greece, creating a very large military. And every single time they would take over a place, we believe that they would adopt that military into their own and actually kind of gobble it up, right? So in this process, as we can see it with their growing conquest and the areas of which they are expanding into, because as you can see right over here, they took over all these different cities and kept expanding their influence and bringing the people into their own culture and using them inside of their military. But this is a big deal, though. Something you got to notice when we're talking about all this is that, looking at this, looks like they're not alone, right? So the Mycenaeans were over here in this pink, and then you have all these other major empires that were around as well that were willing to go to war with the Mycenaeans at the drop of a hat, right? Now, granted, for the Mycenaeans, it was good for them that they were located very far westward, which kept them a little bit safe, but the biggest group of people that they disliked the most was this area in blue right here, known as the Hittites, right? The Hittites and the Mycenaeans did not get along. The Mycenaeans did not like them, mostly due to the fact that the Hittites wanted to control trade coming in and out of the Aegean and also this sector of the Mediterranean Sea. Well, the Mycenaeans were like, we have conquered all of these islands, and this is all of our goods and product. We want to control these trade routes going in and out of here. Now, the thing about it was that the Mycenaeans never wanted to attack the Hittites directly because they thought they might lose, right? But a very important moment in Greek storytelling happened when the Mycenaeans wanted to control more trade, right? And this whole thing is their myth that relates to the Mycenaeans, right? It actually comes from this story known as the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Trojan War, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that this was written about like 700 years later. Again, just like the Minoan one, written over 1,000 years later by the Athenians. This is one of them that was written about 700 years later by this guy named Homer, and we'll talk about him here in a second, right? The big thing about it, though, is that the Iliad and the Odyssey revolve around a historical event that we do know actually happened between a war between the city-state of Troy and the city-state of Mycenae, or and the Mycenaeans. So here are the Mycenaeans, and here, right there, is the city-state of Troy, right? Now, the city-state of Troy may have actually aligned or allied with the Hittites, really, really making the Mycenaeans mad and leading to this massive war that broke out between them and the Trojans, right? Now, looking at this entire thing, we do believe it was motivated by trade in real life, right? Like, we believe that the real-life event known as the Trojan War was probably motivated by trade. But there's this entire mythological story about what actually happened, and it all boils down to a woman, right? All boils down to a woman who apparently had a face so beautiful that she could launch 1,000 ships, and her name was Helen of Troy, right? So the way the story goes...
3 hours later.
They gift it to the Trojans and stuff like that, and they hide inside of it and then emerge out of it and kill all the Trojans and destroy the city, right? So the thing about it, though, in general, is that that story is so famous that there's a movie with Brad Pitt in it, like that made about it and stuff like that. It's called Troy. It's actually pretty good. So now the big thing about it, though, is, but just like the Minoans, just like them, all of a sudden, the Mycenaeans are going to fall as well, right? So this all coincides with a really, really big event known as the Bronze Age collapse, right? So when we're looking at historical time periods of ancient Greece, we've got the first four, right? And the first four are Nathan eats bacon, meanwhile mommy, right? And it's Neolithic, Early Bronze, Minoan, Mycenaean. But then all of a sudden, something crazy happens right here. And then the next four are the Dark Ages, the Archaic, the Classical, the Hellenistic, right? Well, obviously, as we can tell, we need to know what the heck happened in that event. Well, we call that event the Bronze Age collapse, right? The Bronze Age collapse, we believe, happened between the Mycenaean period and the Dark Ages period, right? The sad thing is we don't know what happened, right? I hate to break it to y'all right now, but again, our written records of these things are very, very dismal, and we don't really know what went down. Could have been a natural disaster, could have been a series of earthquakes, could have been a series of volcanic explosions, could have been a series of migrations by barbarians and stuff. We don't know what happened. We have no clue what happened, but we do know that most of the big empires at the time that we were just talking about, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, the Hittites, everybody else, basically, all those different colors that were on that map, saw widespread destruction and economic falls. And we've looked at all of their records, and none of them say why this has happened. But we do know that after the Bronze Age collapse, we actually see the beginning of the use of iron, right? So when we actually separate these two periods into two different parts, it's kind of the Bronze Age on this side and the Iron Age on this side. Now, iron is a better metal than bronze. It's not an alloy. It's actually a pure metal. It's stronger, sturdier, more resistant to oxidation, and can hold an edge for longer, right? So ironically enough, technology continued to advance, but there was this really, really crazy collapse right here that actually really, really made everybody struggle, right? And like I said, we don't really know what went down, but this is a map right here of all these different things, and as you can see, all these different cataclysmic events that happened, and look at all these question marks and stuff. Literally, we're we don't know, don't know, we don't know. Like, so in the Bronze Age collapse led to the end of the Mycenaeans, right? The Mycenaeans would fall, their city would be abandoned, and we don't really know what happened, but we do know that we then entered into this period known as the Greek Dark Ages, right? Now, a Dark Age is very, very important because all the intelligence of the Mycenaeans and the Minoans has now gone pretty much like, and it's just kind of left, right? A Dark Age is exactly what it sounds like. A Dark Age is a time where there is bad art, there is no writing, population is going down, whereas history 9 times out of 10, population always goes up, right? There were periods of famine, but they are going to start working with iron. So again, like, this is like why I have a little asterisk right here, because like iron is better than bronze and it's more technologically advanced, but the rest of their time was really, really bad. And like, look at, this is bad art, right? Like, so that is art that was coming out during the Dark Ages of Greece. This is called the centaur sculpture that came out during the Dark Ages of Greece. We had Minoan and Mycenaean frescoes and gold working and all this other really nice stuff, and the palaces of Knossos and the stronghold of Mycenaea. But then we're making this during the Dark Ages, right? And so the Greek Dark Ages are a time of disorder, right? The Mycenaeans were replaced as well, or possibly invaded. We're not positive. They could have been one of the question marks that were on there. We're not sure. But by this new group of people known as the Dorians, right? I'm going to say it again. The Dorians. I'm going to say it one more time. The Dorians. I'm going to say it upside down. The Dorians. All right, so now look, it's very important that you know who the Dorians are. Now, like, so the Dorians show up and they start settling the area of Peloponnese near the old school Mycenaea. They may have invaded them. They may have battled them. They might have destroyed the Mycenaeans. We don't know, right? So, like, they could have been the reason why this all fell. But as you can see, the Dorians aren't as smart as the Mycenaeans, right? Which a lot of you are probably like, then how'd they beat them? Could have been just bigger numbers. They could have had way more people, right? We're not positive, but we do know that they show up and they start like really changing the dynamic of what is modern day Greek, right? And they start calling themselves Hellenas or gifts of the Hellenas, or like Helen, like and stuff like that, which means Greek in modern day English and stuff like that. And so the Dorians are actually kind of like more Greek than the Mycenaeans and the Minoans were. It's a very, very weird thing. And I'm sorry if I'm confusing you and stuff like that. But the Dorians show up. And the sad part about it is they couldn't read and write, though. Their population was declining. They were having periods of famine. They destroyed all the smart things that the Mycenaeans and the Minoans did. And so they're kind of the reason why the Dark Ages in Greece actually happened. And the only history that relates back to the Dorians and the Dark Ages of ancient Greece are oral stories that weren't written down, right? Just like word of mouth stories, right? Told by this guy named Homer, who was a blind poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now let's talk about how stupid of a phrase that is. He's blind, but he wrote the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you go out, the Iliad is that whole story we talked about in this flip, right? Of Helen of Troy and Paris of Troy and Hector and Achilles and Agamemnon and all that stuff, and the big war between the Trojans and the Mycenaeans, right? But Homer apparently told this during this giant reset period. Oh, by the way, why I have that reset button right there is because I feel like the Dark Ages are just like a reset button. They're like, let's try again, bam, and they just like start all over again. But we don't even know if Homer existed, right? Like, so we have no clue if he was real, right? Because apparently, according to tradition, he was led around by a little boy because he was blind and couldn't see anything. And like, so we don't even know if this guy was a real person, but apparently he is credited with writing the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you go to a Barnes & Noble and buy the Iliad and the Odyssey right now, it says by Homer on it, right? And this is going to create this whole thing known as the Trojan epic cycle, right? And so basically, in a nutshell, Homer's stories were all based off the Trojan War, right? The war between the Mycenaeans and the Trojans. And it's the only reason why we even have some kind of historical account that it actually even happened. And like the Mycenaeans didn't write it down. Like we had to like trust Homer's story and stuff like that. So like the one big story he told was the Iliad first. The second story he told was the Odyssey. And it's about Odysseus, this other figure trying to get home. You probably like, if you ever read the Percy Jackson books when you were a kid and stuff like that, a lot of elements of the Odyssey are related to that. If you ever seen the movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's based on the Odyssey. And we'll talk about it a little bit in class as well. But then it was such a big deal, the writing of these two stories, that another story was written over 1,000 years later called the Aeneid by the Romans, and they even attribute their founding to the Trojan War and to the stories of Homer, which is just crazy. You know what I'm talking about? Like, it's like that big of a deal, and ironically enough, none of it was written down. Like, we have these stories that were just told over and over again. And the other big element too is that probably means that it's not even like very close to the original telling of the story, right? So getting into it, this is the last little thing on this flip. I know this is intense, but I believe in you. I know Brianna and I talked about this in one of my classes, and she was like, I'm getting this. I understand what's going on. I like that, right? And if you need any help at all, you're always more than welcome to come see me in S period. But however, around 700 BC, writing is going to come back, trade is going to return, new city-states are going to be founded, the Olympics begin, and the Greeks are going to show up in the way you've heard of them before. And that's when we enter into the Archaic Period, right? The Archaic Period is all about the rise of Greece under Athens and Sparta, right? And Athens and Sparta are such big deals in our modern day economics and modern day world that literally there is a university in Michigan that their mascot is known as the Spartans. That's how much of a big deal they are. And there's even a city in Georgia named after Athens, right? Now, the biggest thing about it in totality, though, is we will talk all about that stuff when I see y'all in class. Y'all have a good one. We are going to keep moving fast. I'm proud of y'all. Y'all keep it going. Y'all are so sweet and so kind, and I love teaching y'all so far, so let's keep it up, all right? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.